Our speaker tonight is Matthew Roberts. He's a fourth-year medical student and an aspiring neurologist at the Medical University of South Carolina. After being diagnosed with type 3 Ehlers-Danlos in his first year of medical school, Matthew founded the Alliance for Disability Advocacy, working closely with the administration to reduce barriers and improve accessibility for other students living with disabilities at MUSC. Through the group, Matthew has organized campus discussions on disability and led workshops on self-advocacy and applying for accommodations. So thank you so much, Matthew. Come on up and join us. And if you need a water, I have a water right back here.
Alrighty, thank you so much, Nancy, for the introduction. So, again, my name is Matthew Roberts. I'm a fourth-year medical student here at MUSC, and wanted to talk to you about the accommodations process, having been through it both from the school front and from the workplace front. Thought I could shed some light on this. So, just a quick overview, an outline of what I want to talk about today. So, number one, first, what are our legal rights when requesting accommodations? And this is really the most boring part of the talk, but it's extremely important because if you don't know what your rights are, systems can take advantage of you, right? And you can put yourself in a position where you suffer unnecessarily because you don't know that there are avenues that you can make your situation better. Next, what sort of accommodations out there exist? What's something that you can expect to request? And then how do you actually go about starting that conversation? What are the things that you should do before you walk into that meeting? Make sure that you're best prepared and you get the outcome that works the best for you. And then also just some handy resources where you can look to get more information, because this talk could be several days long, and so I'll try to do as much as I can in 20 minutes to help start that process, but there's a wealth of really amazing information out there, so I chose some choice links to start, at least. So just a quick disclaimer, I'm not a physician, I cannot offer any medical advice, and I'm certainly not a lawyer, so I cannot offer any legal advice, and I have no financial disclosures, but I have been through the process, and so hopefully I have some experience, both with some of the symptoms that many of you probably have dealt with, and how to go about making systems work for you. Cool, so let's dig in. So first, what is the law? So the American with Disabilities Act prohibits discrimination on the basis of workers' disabilities. So that is in the hiring process, that is on the job, that means they can't fire you for your disability. It covers a very broad scope of it. And it first begs the question of, well, like, what is a disability? Because legal definitions are not the same as medical definitions are not the same as other definitions. And so what the Act specifically provides for us is that employers must provide reasonable accommodations to allow employees to thrive. And so then, of course, what is reasonable? That's a very broad term. So under the law, this is how they define a disability: any physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So again, fairly broad, but that means this really isn't a medical disability. You don't even have to have a diagnosis, right? As long as you have something that limits your capacity to perform your job due to medical, mental health issues, then that is a disability. And the law, these are all direct quotes from the law as it's written, that it is meant to be used as broadly and as liberally as possible that the law can permit. And so it's really in your favor in many, many different ways to take advantage of this to get the accommodations that you need. And so then, right, you don't have to have issues with a broad swath of things in order to request a disability. So just because you may be good at your job, just because your grades are fine, that doesn't mean you don't need accommodations, right? And the same thing is true in the workplace. So next, if for whatever reason the issues that you deal with are things that are not always present, they come and go, they may be seasonal, you may have good days and bad days like all the rest of us, and you don't have to always be sick. You don't have to always have issues to be considered a disability. If you ever have it, you qualify. Next, if you wear braces and they help and they make your pain better, if you have other accommodations already in place, just because you are more functional because of those braces doesn't mean you don't have a disability, right? They can't deny your request for accommodations because you already have things that help, right? Like, you wouldn't say that somebody who's fighting cancer doesn't have cancer because their chemotherapy is working, right? So there's a lot of these little caveats that, again, are really important to take into consideration, so that way when you're meeting with people, you know what your rights are. So then the next sort of broad definition is, what is a major life activity? So I'm honestly impressed how broad of a definition that they use. So basically any function of life, and so that's performing tasks, seeing, hearing, eating, sleeping, walking. I won't read all of these for you, but on top of that, it also includes basically every bodily function. And I'm thinking on Ehlers-Danlos, on mast cell activation syndromes. I mean, there are a whole slew of bodily functions that don't work the way they should, right? All of you qualify. Okay. So then what is a reasonable accommodation? So first there's like the general thing that we all think of when we think of accommodations, right? It's accessible stalls and bathrooms. I mean, these are things that come to mind because they're the few things that have existed for 30, 40 years going back, right? Accessible parking spots, but it's so much more than that. Now, there are also limitations on what is considered reasonable. So first, it cannot create undue hardship to the employer. So this is significant difficulty or expense. And the way the law is written, it is on the burden of proof is on the employer, right, to demonstrate this. All you have to make is say that you have a disability, right, that you would like accommodations. You don't have to prove that other than giving documentation for what you experience. It's entirely on the employer, on the company to say that they can't do this. And the legal scrutiny that goes into saying that this is undue hardship is a really uphill process for them. So this really is written in your favor, and there are several Supreme Court precedents and legal precedents for making this a very difficult thing for the company to deny. Now, and they're also not required to reallocate essential job functions. Let's say you're a hand model. If you lose your hand in a shark bite, you can't perform the essential functions of your job, right? And it's a silly example, but like for me in the College of Medicine, in order to enter the College of Medicine, you have to meet just basic requirements, right? You have to be able to get around, whether that's by wheelchair, whether that's on your feet, by whatever means necessary. You have to be able to see patients, right? A lot of diagnosis is using our eyes. You have to be able to touch patients. A lot of diagnosis is being able to perform a physical exam. And so every job, whatever it is, has basic functions that you have to have. And it's not discrimination to prevent somebody from doing a job if the functions that the job requires at its core are not performable by the person. So those are the two main caveats. And so these first sets of examples of reasonable accommodations are directly out of the law. These are all in the text of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So first, job restructuring, right? Modified work schedules. And so if you can demonstrate that it would not create, or it's not even on you to demonstrate this, but it is not an excessive burden to allow somebody to shift their schedule such that, maybe instead of working, if long shifts are difficult, if they need to make it to doctor's appointments, they need to make it to PT appointments during business hours, to work shorter days if they work in an additional day other time, right? Picking up shifts, but working shorter shifts, or even transitioning to part-time. Obviously if your company has 3 employees, stepping back the amount of work that you do could really be undue hardship for the company, right? But if you work at MUSC and you MUSC has 12,000 employees. If you shift to part-time, it will not create undue burden for the company, right? And so that is absolutely within your rights. Also, reassignment to vacant positions. So if the job that you're performing is not hyper-specialized, if you can perform a multitude of tasks within your job, it's absolutely reasonable to request to perform a job that's currently unoccupied within the company. Also, one of the things that was mentioned already, modification of examinations, training materials, application materials, anything like that. Some other things that commonly come up: ergonomic keyboards, ergonomic mice, right? Telephone headsets so you don't have to hold something, crick your neck all day, video phones so you don't have to hold anything at all, adjustable height desks, whether they're for wheelchairs, whether they're standing desks, anything like that. Modified equipment controls, if you have hand limitations. Another thing that I would have never thought of, development of emergency evacuation issues for individuals with mobility issues to make sure that there are safe plans of egress for those who have difficulty navigating. Also, accessible drinking fountains. I was trying to think when I was seeing what accommodations might apply to Chiari, and we have many patients that I see even now in Gen Neuro that have spinal fusion starting from their occiput and going halfway down their back. Bending over to drink from a water fountain would be pretty much impossible, right? And so things like that are very reasonable to request. Next, options to work off-site, work at home for parts of the job. Maybe all of the job can be done at home, maybe none of it can. But this is the process of thinking about some of the things that may be possible depending on what the details of your job are. Anti-glare screens to reduce eye strain, there that is again. Modified equipment controls, once again. Can you tell that I have a hand issue? Also, flexible unpaid leave. Oh my. So, almost all jobs that are full-time offer, this is very finicky, offer some form of leave, paid or unpaid. And one of the easiest ways to take advantage of that is to request that to be used in an as-needed basis. It doesn't have to be in chunks, it can be whatever is flexible. So you can set it up such that it's flexible to serve your needs, whether you have emergency medical issues that arise, you need to take time off. Those are things that you absolutely can and should use whenever you can. All right, so just a little bit of stats on this, because I think a lot of accommodations, when you're trying to think about physical accommodations, cost money. But if you look at the statistics nationally on what are the accommodations that are requested, a third of them have absolutely no cost at all. Half of them cost less than $50, right? And you can see as you go up, 70% cost less than $500 and 88% cost less than $1,000. And so I think it's important to recognize this for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's reasonable to get accommodations for things that cost over $1,000. You shouldn't limit your thinking just because something is expensive, right? Next, that a lot of things that can be done to improve your life are free and reasonable, and there's no reason why they shouldn't accommodate that. Okay, so next, how to actually go about getting accommodations. So quick overview of the 5 steps. First is you gotta brainstorm. There's a lot of stuff that you gotta consider really carefully before you ever go approaching and setting up a meeting. Then how do you get the most out of the meeting once you're in it? Making sure that you agree on the accommodations once you've been through that meeting, once they've proposed the accommodations, and then when they've implemented, continue to evaluate the accommodation and make sure it's still serving your needs. All right, so let's go through these. So step 1 is brainstorming. Now, I say this all the time in the Alliance for Disability Advocacy, but you have to be your best advocate, right? Nobody knows your situation better than you do. Nobody will fight for you as hard as you. And so it is extremely important that you practice good self-advocacy, and I think it's an important step for anybody, but especially with disability, right? So questions that you really want to answer. Number one, what are the essential functions of your job? And then, what are the limitations that you have related to your disability? And what tasks then become difficult to do because of those difficulties? And it's so, so important to write all of this stuff down when you're brainstorming. Next, how do these limitations impact your performance? Well, in a little bit I'll talk about disclosing your disability, but it's not enough just to have something. You have to at least, you don't have to prove, but you have to at least say that because of this, I have trouble, right? It's impacting your performance. And from an employer's standpoint, I mean, if you're demonstrating that things are causing your performance to suffer, it's in their own self-interest to eliminate those obstacles so you can perform better. Next, what sort of accommodations could help each of these limitations? Come up with several possible solutions to each one that, if you can. And write them all down, weigh each solution against each other, compare what you think their efficacy would be in helping you. And then do a little bit of research. What existing solutions already exist? You know, disability is extremely heterogeneous, and so while there may be pre-made things that help some people, there may not be for other times. And just see what's out there, see what could help. How expensive are they? Right? The more information you have when you come into the meeting, the more likely you are for this process to A, go quickly, and B, end in a result that is really beneficial. So next, set up a meeting, either with your direct manager or human resources, depending on the size and scale of the company in which you work. If they're already aware of your disability, then you can say when you're requesting a meeting, say, hey, I'd really like to talk about accommodations. You can say, is there already a formal process that is in place for requesting accommodations? Obviously, as companies get bigger, they implement policies specifically for this. Higher education in particular is very good about having a streamlined process. Now, how effective that process is an entire different story, but they have a process, and so you don't have to reinvent the wheel often. And so asking and figuring out what it is that they already have in place is useful. And then next, how to get the most out of the meeting itself. First and foremost, you have to disclose your disability. Under the ADA, employers are only required to provide any accommodations of which they've been of which you've informed them. It's not enough to just assume that they can see you hurting or they've heard you talk about it in informal settings for it to count, right? You have to actually make a disclosure. Next, be prepared to bring corroborating documentation. You may not need this, but in case you do, you obviously want to have that ready in there with you. You certainly can bring it at a later time, but everything that you walk into the meeting with will save you time in actually getting things implemented. So it's certainly helpful. And keep in mind that this doesn't have to be a formal diagnosis because disability is not a medical diagnosis, right? It can be anything. So even occupational therapist assessment is all you need, a physical therapist assessment. Sure, an MD will work fine too, but that's not what it has to be, right? And then, once you come to the meeting, be sure you can tell them and describe your disability and how it is limiting your work and the difficulties that you experience because of this. And this is, again, where having written down all of this in your brainstorming session is really helpful. I highly recommend coming to the meeting with a lot of this typed out. It's useful, our memories are terrible, not just me in particular, but your manager's memory is terrible. And when you leave this meeting, unless they've taken really good notes, they're not really going to remember every aspect of it. Hell, I can't even remember all of my own symptoms because Ehlers-Danlos affects like every damn thing in the body, it seems, right? So it's useful to write these things down. So that way they can make sure that when they're coming up with their solutions as well, that they're addressing each of your needs. And then share the solutions you've come up with, right? If they're pre-existing products, have a link there with it where they could purchase it, where they could go directly to obtaining it. Not all accommodations are that simple and straightforward, but some of them certainly may be, and so having that already there for them is helpful. And explaining how they would help. All right, then initiate a dialogue, right? This is a two-way street. You know your disability better than everybody, but they know the essential functions, they know the policies, the practices, the systems in place within the company, the corporation, institution. And so their input is also important. They know what resources they have. And so having their input and having this two-way dialogue is extremely important to getting useful accommodations. Ask for feedback, right? If you've come up with a couple of solutions, ask them how feasible they are. Ask them if they think that they could do better. All reasonable things to request. And then agree on a timeline to follow up and write everything down. I know you've come in with your notes, but write down everything that's said, that's talked about, that's agreed upon, because heaven forbid you ever end up in a situation where you have to defend this, not necessarily in court, but to HR, to their manager, whatever down the line. You really want to make sure you've documented everything. It's like the single most important piece of advice I maybe can give you in this entire time is write everything down. Okay. Next, come to an agreement. So if they've given you a solution, at the end of the day, they are the ones who are suggesting an accommodation, right? And so once they have deliberated on it, they've come to a decision, that is not the end of the discussion. And so if you, for any reason, don't feel like it will satisfy your needs or only solve part of a problem, speak up. And because you're not obligated to accept them, right? You can accept part of it, you can accept none of it. You can go back to the drawing board completely if need be, but only if you speak up, right? But if, on the other hand, if things go well, you think that their solution is acceptable and that it will help you, then let's figure out a timeline. It's one thing to say, all right, we'll do that for you. And then you leave the meeting and when's that gonna happen? I don't know. I've had that happen before and it sucks. So when I'll give you a short side story. When I was applying for accommodations through the hospital to wear my braces during surgery, obviously surgery is a sterile environment. The braces are made out of silver. They can be autoclaved. They can be entirely sterile for surgery. I submitted a request to wear these during surgery, and they said, perfect, we'll get back to you. And then my surgery rotation started a month later. Emailed them, hey, I kind of need these now. Can't do anything without them. Oh yeah, we're gonna meet about that in 2 weeks. Good. Okay, so figuring out these timelines ahead of time is really useful. They got approved on the last week of my 6-week rotation. Not prime. A lot of time watching. So, agree on a timeline. And last, evaluate the implementation, right? The process is ongoing. Once that they've implemented, that does not mean that your work is done. It does not mean that their work is done. Right? Communicate whether they've been effective. Are they working as anticipated? Is there still ways that they could be improved? And if they're working great, things change, more things break down, don't be afraid to revisit it, right? This is never something that's closed and sealed, and once you've accepted something, that's just the way it is from now on, right? It's always an ongoing process. Alrighty, so a few useful resources. I know this is all relatively tiny font, but they're clickable links, and so I figured it'd be better if you could just click them on your own. So, quick walkthrough. First of them, this first one is a really wonderful overall guide that covers a lot of what I've talked about today, how to negotiate the accommodation process. Then the next one is a very legal-easy set of questions and answers and scenarios, and it is extremely helpful. They go into, I think, 45, 47 specific examples of a problem, a solution that would be reasonable, and a solution that would not be reasonable for every single problem, every single solution. What is considered an undue burden, right? What is considered reasonable? This is a really good resource to get your idea behind. Once you've come up with the things that you want to ask for, if you want to gauge it against what has been legally demonstrated to be reasonable, what is legally demonstrated to not be undue burden, this is a great resource, the second one there. Next, Pandas, the Protection Advocacy for People with Disabilities, is a really wonderful organization. Every state has one. PandasSC.org is the one for South Carolina. They offer no charge services. They can give you legal advice. They can give you general advice for requesting accommodations, general advice for how to make your life easier living with a disability. It's a really wonderful nonprofit organization. And the last, just another good general resource to round it out, National Disability Resource Network is another really great website. They have a whole bunch of resources there. Oh, and I skipped the Ehlers-Danlos one. On the Job Accommodation Network, which is both the first and the fourth link up there, they have specific accommodations that they've seen people get in the past, what's reasonable for multiple diagnoses. Alas, Chiari and syringomyelia are not in that list of things, but somehow Ehlers-Danlos is, and so given the overlap of symptomatology, it's certainly something that you may find useful. I mean, for every possible function of a job, they have like 70 different examples of accommodations. It's really impressive. So another good resource that's hopefully somewhat relevant to all of us.